You felt it before you could explain it, that quiet shift in the atmosphere when you walked into certain spaces, the subtle change in how people looked at you, the conversations that softened or stopped altogether, and the strange sense that something about you was being observed more closely than it should have been. And you tried to brush it off, telling yourself you were overthinking, telling yourself it was nothing, but deep down you knew something wasn't right. Because this wasn't just in your head, this was real. And what you didn't realize at the time is that while you were simply living your life, showing up as yourself, growing at your own pace, someone was studying you in silence, not to celebrate you, not to support you, but to understand you in a way that would give them control over how others perceived you. And that kind of attention doesn't come randomly chosen one. It comes when your presence carries something rare, something that can't be easily defined, something that makes people feel exposed without you even saying a word. And that is exactly why this message is finding you right now, because something is shifting, something is being uncovered, and the same people who once watched you quietly, thinking they had you figured out, are now unsettled by the version of you that stands before them today. A version they didn't predict, a version they cannot manage, a version that no longer fits inside the narrative they tried to build. And before we go any further, if this is already resonating with you, if you feel that quiet confirmation rising in your spirit, take a second right now and press the like button, subscribe to this channel, and comment. See it now below, because what you are about to hear is not just another message. It is a confirmation of what you have been sensing all along. And once you see it clearly, you will never look at your past the same way again. And more importantly, you will finally understand why everything had to unfold the way it did. Long before anything felt off, long before the tension became visible and the distance became undeniable, there was already a quiet observation taking place around you, a kind of attention that didn't announce itself, didn't make noise, didn't reveal its intention. But it was there, steady and patient, watching how you moved, how you responded, how you carried yourself in moments when you thought no one was paying attention. And that's the part that matters the most, because chosen one, you were never performing, you were never trying to impress, you were simply being. And that authenticity made you readable in a way that others who operate behind masks found both fascinating and threatening at the same time. Because while most people carefully construct the version of themselves they show the world, you moved through life with a kind of natural consistency that couldn't be easily manipulated or predicted. And for someone who relies on control, that kind of presence becomes something they feel the need to study, not out of admiration, but out of a quiet urgency to understand what they cannot replicate. And so they began collecting details, small things that seemed insignificant on their own, but became powerful when pieced together over time. They noticed how you reacted when you were under pressure. They noticed what made you hesitate and what made you stand firm. They noticed your patterns of kindness, your willingness to give people the benefit of the doubt, your tendency to internalize rather than confront. And none of this felt dangerous to you because you were operating from a place of sincerity. You assumed that people were engaging with you on the same level of honesty that you were bringing into the world. But that assumption, as pure as it was, became the very opening they needed, because while you were showing up as yourself, they were showing up with an agenda. And that difference in intention is what created the imbalance from the very beginning. And you couldn't see it yet, because nothing had been done openly, nothing had been said directly. There was no clear confrontation, no obvious betrayal, just a subtle accumulation of awareness on their side, and an unguarded openness on yours. And that dynamic is important to understand, because it explains why everything that followed felt so confusing. Because when the impact finally reached you, it didn't match your memory of how things had unfolded. You couldn't trace it back to a single moment, a single conversation, a single decision. And that's because it didn't begin with a moment. It began with a process, a quiet, methodical process of observation that took place while you were focused on living, growing, and becoming. And this is where most people misunderstand their own story. They think the problem started when things became uncomfortable. But in reality, the foundation of that discomfort was being built long before they ever felt it. And in your case, chosen one, it started the moment your presence revealed something in others that they were not ready to face within themselves, because there is a certain kind of light that doesn't just illuminate the path ahead. It also exposes what others are trying to keep hidden. And you carried that light without even realizing it, not because you were trying to stand out, but because you refused to shrink into versions of yourself that didn't feel true. And that refusal, that quiet alignment with who you are, became the very thing that drew attention to you in ways you didn't anticipate. And the ones who noticed were not always the ones who celebrated you. In fact, the most observant ones were often the most threatened, because they saw something in you that disrupted their sense of control. And instead of confronting that discomfort within themselves, they turned their focus outward toward you, trying to map you out, trying to predict you, trying to find the edges of your personality so they could understand where you might break. And that's why they paid attention to moments that others overlooked. They watched how you handled disappointment. They watched how you treated people who couldn't offer you anything in return. They watched how you responded when you were misunderstood. And each of these observations became data in a narrative they were slowly constructing. Not a narrative about who you truly are, but a version of you that could be shaped, framed, and eventually presented to others in a way that served their own agenda. And the reason this worked for as long as it did is because you were not operating from suspicion. You were operating from trust, and you believed in taking people at face value. You believed in giving people space to be human. You believed that not every silence meant something negative, and those beliefs are not weaknesses, they are reflections of your character, but in the hands of someone who is studying you for the wrong reasons. Those same qualities can be used as entry points, because while you were extending understanding, they were extracting information, and that imbalance is what allowed them to move without being detected. And it's important for you to see this clearly now, not so you can become guarded in a way that disconnects you from who you are, but so you can understand that what happened was not a failure on your part. It was a calculated process on theirs, and recognizing that changes everything, because it removes the question of what did I do wrong, and replaces it with a deeper awareness of what was actually happening around me. And that awareness is the beginning of your power. Because once you see the pattern, you can no longer be confused by the outcome. And that's exactly where you are right now, standing at the edge of a realization that redefines your entire experience. Because what felt random was not random. What felt personal was not always about you, and what felt like rejection was often the result of a narrative being built before you even had the chance to speak, and the truth is chosen one they were watching long before you noticed. Not because you were doing something wrong, but because you were carrying something they couldn't ignore, something they couldn't replicate, something they couldn't control. And now that you're beginning to see it for what it is, you're no longer the same person they thought they understood. And that shift alone changes the entire dynamic moving forward. And then there came a moment, subtle at first, almost invisible in real time. A shift so quiet you didn't recognize it as it was happening, yet powerful enough to change how you were perceived from that point forward. And this was not the moment you achieved something loud or undeniable. It was not when you stood on a stage or reached a milestone that forced people to acknowledge you, a chosen one. The moment you became a threat was far more internal than that. It was the moment your energy stopped asking for permission. The moment you no longer needed validation to feel grounded in who you were. The moment your presence carried a kind of calm authority that didn't require explanation. And that is what unsettled them, because control is easiest when someone is still searching for approval, when someone is still adjusting themselves to fit the expectations around them. But you began to outgrow that phase without making an announcement, without declaring it to anyone. And that quiet transformation is what made it so dangerous to those who had already been studying you, because the version of you they thought they understood was no longer accurate. And suddenly, the patterns they had mapped out no longer worked the way they expected. The reactions they predicted didn't happen. The responses they were waiting for never came. And that unpredictability is what shifted their attention from observation into strategy. Because when someone can no longer anticipate you, they begin to feel a loss of control. And when control starts slipping, fear begins to take its place. And that fear does not always show up as panic or confrontation. It often shows up as calculation, as a quiet decision to move differently, to adjust tactics, to use what has already been gathered in a more intentional way. And that is exactly what happened. Because the moment you stopped needing their approval, you unknowingly removed the leverage they thought they had over you. And that forced them to find another way to maintain influence. And this is where the shift becomes critical to understand, because up until this point, they were simply watching, collecting, analyzing. But now they began to act not in a way that would expose them, but in a way that would shape how others saw you before you even entered the room. And this is why everything started to feel different, without a clear cause, because the environment around you had already been adjusted based on a version of you that no longer existed, and yet you were still being treated according to that outdated narrative. And that disconnect created confusion, because you could feel that something was off, but you couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. You could sense the shift in energy, but you couldn't trace it back to a specific interaction. And that is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can go through, because it makes you question yourself. It makes you wonder if you've changed in a negative way, if you've done something wrong without realizing it. And that internal questioning is exactly what they were counting on, because as long as you were focused on figuring yourself out, you were less likely to look outward and recognize what was actually happening. And this is why it's so important for you to see this clearly now, because the moment you became a threat was not a reflection of something you did wrong. It was a reflection of something you outgrew. You outgrew the need to be explained. You outgrew the need to be approved. You outgrew the version of yourself that could be easily influenced by how others perceived you. And that kind of growth creates a natural separation between you and those who are still operating from control, because they can no longer access you in the same way. And instead of respecting that evolution, they try to compensate for it. They try to recreate the version of you that they understood. And when that fails, they begin to redefine you in a way that fits their narrative. And this is where their strategy begins to take shape, because they realize that if they cannot control you directly, they can attempt to control how others interpret you, and that becomes their new focus, and not changing who you are, but influencing how you are seen. And that shift is subtle but powerful, because it allows them to maintain a sense of control without ever having to confront you openly. And from your perspective, it feels like things are changing for no reason, like the ground beneath you is shifting without warning. But from their perspective, it is a calculated adjustment to a new reality, a reality where you are no longer predictable, no longer dependent, no longer within their reach. And that is what makes you a threat, not because you are trying to challenge them, not because you are trying to expose them, but because your very existence in that new state disrupts the structure they were relying on. And this is the part that many people never fully understand, because they think being a threat means being aggressive or confrontational. But in your case, chosen one, it means being grounded, being self-aware, being internally stable in a way that cannot be easily shaken. And that kind of presence is far more difficult to deal with than someone who is openly combative, because it cannot be easily labeled, it cannot be easily dismissed, and it cannot be easily controlled. And as this realization settles in, you begin to see your past from a different perspective. You begin to understand that the shift you felt was not a coincidence. It was a response to the version of you that was emerging. The version of you that no longer fit into the framework they had built, and that awareness is not meant to make you paranoid. It is meant to make you clear about who you are, clear about what changed, and clear about why certain dynamics no longer feel the same. Because once you understand that the moment you became a threat was the moment you stepped into yourself more fully, you stop seeing it as a problem and start seeing it as confirmation. Confirmation that you are moving in the right direction, confirmation that your growth is real, and confirmation that the discomfort you experienced was not a sign to shrink back, but a sign that you were stepping beyond the limits that others were comfortable with. And now that you can see that you are no longer navigating this blindly, you are moving with awareness, with understanding, and with a level of clarity that changes everything about how you move forward. Because you are no longer trying to fit into spaces that were designed for a version of you that no longer exists. You are stepping into spaces that align with who you are becoming, and that is where your true power begins to unfold. And once that shift had taken place, once you unknowingly stepped into a version of yourself that could no longer be predicted or quietly influenced, their approach had to evolve, because observation alone was no longer enough to give them the sense of control they once had. And this is where the situation became more intentional, more strategic, or layered than anything you could have imagined at the time, because instead of confronting you directly, instead of creating a visible conflict that could be traced back to them, they chose a method that was far more subtle and far more effective. They began to use what they had learned about you, not in its full truth, but in fragments, carefully selected pieces of reality that could be rearranged into something that looked believable from the outside but did not reflect the fullness of who you are. And this is what made it so dangerous. Chosen one, because complete lies are easy to detect. They fall apart under scrutiny. They sound exaggerated. They lack grounding, but partial truths that are taken out of context, reshaped and delivered with confidence. Those are the ones that move quietly. Those are the ones that settle into people's minds without resistance. Those are the ones that begin to influence perception before anyone even thinks to question them. And that is exactly the space they operated in. They didn't need to invent a new version of you from nothing. They only needed to distort the existing one just enough to create doubt. And doubt, once planted, does not require constant reinforcement. It grows on its own, especially in environments where people are already inclined to believe what aligns with their biases or insecurities. And so they took your silence, the moments where you chose not to react, not to defend yourself, not to engage in unnecessary conflict, and they reframed it as distance, as coldness, as arrogance. They took your kindness, your willingness to give people space, your habit of seeing the good in others even when it wasn't obvious, and they reframed it as weakness, as naivety, as something to be questioned rather than respected. They took your growth, the natural process of evolving, changing your mindset at setting new boundaries, and they labeled it inconsistency, instability, something that made you seem unreliable instead of someone who was simply becoming more aligned with themselves. And each of these distortions on its own might not have been enough to shift how people saw you. But together, layered over time, repeated in different forms, in different conversations, in different rooms, they began to create a version of you that others could recognize even if it wasn't accurate. And that recognition is what made it stick, because people trust what feels familiar, even if that familiarity is built on incomplete information. And this is where the real impact began to take shape. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of small adjustments in how people interacted with you, how they responded to you, how they interpreted your presence. And from your perspective, it felt like something intangible was changing, like you were walking into spaces where the energy had already shifted before you even arrived, and that feeling was not imagined. It was the result of a narrative that had been introduced ahead of you. A narrative that you had no control over, because you didn't even know it existed, and that is one of the most challenging aspects of this kind of situation, because it places you in a position where you are being judged based on information you were never given the chance to address. And that can create a sense of isolation, a sense of confusion, a sense of questioning your own reality. Because when the reactions you receive do not match your intentions, it becomes difficult to trust your own perception of events. And that internal conflict is exactly what allows this kind of strategy to persist. Because as long as you are trying to understand what you might have done differently, you are less likely to recognize that the issue was never about your actions in the first place. It was about how those actions were being interpreted through a lens that had already been altered. And this is why clarity is so important at this stage, because once you understand that what was being said about you was not a complete fabrication, but a manipulation of context, you begin to see why it was so effective. You begin to see why it was so difficult to counter. And more importantly, you begin to see why trying to defend yourself against every misinterpretation would have only pulled you deeper into the narrative they created, because engaging with it directly would have given it more visibility, more energy, more space to grow, and whether you realized it or not. Your decision to remain grounded, to not chase every rumor, to not exhaust yourself, trying to correct every misunderstanding, that decision protected you in ways that are only becoming clear now, because while they were investing energy into maintaining a version of you that was not real, you were investing energy into becoming more of who you actually are. And that difference in focus is what ultimately determines the outcome of situations like this, because one path is built on sustaining an illusion, and the other is built on strengthening a reality. And illusions require constant effort to maintain. They require consistency in storytelling. They require alignment between multiple people. They require ongoing reinforcement. And the moment any part of that structure begins to weaken, the entire narrative becomes unstable. While reality, on the other hand, does not need to be defended. In the same way, it reveals itself over time through consistency, through presence, through the simple act of being seen repeatedly in different contexts without contradiction. And that is the position you were moving toward without even realizing it, while they were shaping perceptions in the background. You were living in a way that would eventually expose the gaps in their story. And that is why this phase, as difficult as it may have felt, was not wasted. It was not meaningless. It was part of a larger process that was unfolding in your favor, even when it didn't look like it on the surface, because every moment where you chose not to react impulsively, every moment where you stayed aligned with your values, every moment where you continued to grow instead of shrinking to fit someone else's version of you, those moments were building a foundation that no distortion could permanently override. And now, as you begin to see how everything was being positioned behind the scenes, you are no longer looking at your past through a lens of confusion. You are looking at it with understanding, with awareness, with a clarity that allows you to separate what was real from what was constructed. And that clarity is not just about making sense of what happened. It is about reclaiming your narrative moving forward. Because once you understand how your story was being shaped without your consent, You gain the ability to move in a way that is no longer influenced by that unseen pressure. You stop trying to adjust yourself to match perceptions that were never accurate to begin with. And instead, you begin to operate from a place of truth, a place of alignment, a place of confidence that does not need external validation to feel secure. And that shift is what marks the beginning of a new phase. A phase where you are no longer defined by what was said about you in rooms you were not in, but by what is consistently revealed about you in every space you choose to enter. And that is a level of power that cannot be taken, cannot be manipulated, and cannot be rewritten by anyone who does not have access to your truth. And as all of that quietly unfolded behind the scenes, as fragments of your identity were rearranged into a version that didn't fully represent you, you began to notice something you couldn't quite explain at first, a shift that didn't come with a clear starting point or a single defining moment, but instead crept in gradually, almost like a change in temperature that you only recognize once it has already settled into the room, because suddenly the same spaces that once felt neutral started to feel slightly unfamiliar. The same conversations that once flowed easily carried a strange hesitation. The same people who once engaged with you openly now seemed to hold back just enough for you to feel it, without being able to confront it directly. And this is where the experience became deeply disorienting, because nothing was obvious enough to point to. Nothing was clear enough to call out. And yet everything felt just different enough to make you question your own perception. And that kind of environment is one of the most difficult to navigate, because it operates in the space between what is seen and what is felt, between what is said and what is implied. And in that space, uncertainty begins to grow, because when you can't clearly identify the source of a shift, your mind naturally turns inward, trying to find the answer within yourself, wondering if you said something wrong, if you acted in a way that created distance, if you somehow changed without realizing it. And that internal questioning can become exhausting over time, because you are searching for clarity in a situation where the clarity has been intentionally blurred. And this is the part that many people never fully understand about what you went through, because from the outside, it might look like nothing significant happened. There was no public conflict, no dramatic fallout, no obvious turning point. But internally, you were navigating a constant sense of misalignment, a feeling that something was off without being able to define what it was. And that feeling was not a reflection of your imagination. It was a response to an environment that had been subtly shaped before you even stepped into it. Because by the time you entered certain spaces, a version of you had already been introduced, a version that carried just enough distortion to influence how others received you, and that meant you were not starting from a neutral position. You were starting from a pre-framed perception, one that you had no control over, because you didn't know it existed. And that is what made everything feel heavier than it should have, because you were not just navigating the present moment, you were navigating the weight of something that had already been placed in front of you without your awareness. And yet, despite all of that, you continued to show up. You continued to move forward. You continued to engage with people and opportunities, even when the responses you received didn't fully align with what you were bringing into those spaces. And that consistency, that willingness to keep going, even in the absence of clear understanding, is something that cannot be overlooked, because it reveals a level of resilience that goes beyond surface-level strength. It shows that you were not easily shaken, even when the ground beneath you felt unstable. And that is where the deeper truth begins to emerge. Because while it may have felt like you were being rejected, like doors were closing without reason, like connections were fading without explanation, what was actually happening was far more complex than simple rejection. You were being filtered through a narrative that had been shaped without your input, And that narrative influenced how others interpreted your presence before they even had the chance to experience you directly. And this is why certain reactions felt disproportionate, why certain opportunities seemed to slip away without a clear cause, why certain people distanced themselves without giving you the context you needed to understand it, because they were not responding to you. As you are, they were responding to an idea of you that had already been planted. And that kind of situation creates a very specific kind of pressure, because it places you in a position where your reality and their perception are no longer aligned. And when those two things are out of sync, it becomes difficult to move freely because you are constantly encountering resistance that doesn't match your intentions. And over time, that can lead to a sense of isolation, not just from others, but from your own sense of clarity, because when your experiences don't line up with your expectations, it becomes harder to trust your own understanding of what's happening. And that is exactly why this phase was so important in your journey, because it forced you to develop a deeper level of awareness, a level that goes beyond surface interactions and into the underlying dynamics of the environments you move through. And that awareness is not something that comes easily. It is something that is built through experience, through reflection, through the process of navigating situations that don't immediately make sense. And while it may have felt uncomfortable, while it may have felt confusing, it was also shaping your ability to see more clearly, to recognize patterns, to understand that not everything is as it appears on the surface, and that understanding is what allows you to move differently now, because you are no longer relying solely on what is presented to you. You are paying attention to what is beneath it, to the energy, to the consistency, to the alignment between words and actions. And that shift in perception is what begins to restore your sense of balance, because instead of questioning yourself every time something feels off, you begin to trust that feeling as a signal, not as a flaw. You begin to recognize that your awareness is not something to suppress, but something to refine. And as that awareness grows, the confusion that once surrounded you starts to dissolve, not because the situation itself has completely changed, but because your understanding of it has deepened. And that deeper understanding allows you to see that what you experienced was not random. It was not meaningless. It was part of a larger pattern that was unfolding around you. A pattern that you are now able to recognize for what it is. And that recognition is what shifts your position within it. Because once you can see the pattern, you are no longer controlled by it. You are no longer reacting blindly to circumstances you don't understand. You are responding with clarity, with intention, with a level of awareness that changes how you engage with every space you enter. And that is where your power begins to return, not in a dramatic or confrontational way, but in a quiet, steady way that is rooted in understanding, because you are no longer trying to force alignment in places where it doesn't exist. You are no longer trying to make sense of reactions that were influenced by something outside of your control. Instead, you are recognizing where you are truly seen, where you are truly understood, where your presence is received without distortion. And that recognition allows you to move forward with a sense of direction that was not available to you before. Because now you are not just reacting to what happens around you. You are choosing where to invest your energy based on what aligns with your truth. And that is the shift that changes everything. Because it moves you from a place of confusion into a place of clarity, from a place of questioning into a place of knowing, and from a place of being influenced by unseen forces into a place where you are grounded in your own understanding. And that grounding is what allows you to step into the next phase of your journey with confidence, because you are no longer trying to navigate an environment that was shaped. Without your awareness, you are creating a path that is aligned with who you are becoming. And that path, chosen one, is one that no distortion can redefine, no narrative can override, and no external perception can take away from you. And in the middle of all that shifting energy, in the quiet tension that surrounded you, without ever fully revealing itself, something even more powerful began to take shape within you, something that did not announce itself loudly, something that did not demand attention, but something that would ultimately change the entire trajectory of how this story unfolded. Because instead of reacting the way they expected, instead of chasing clarity from people who were already operating from a distorted perception, instead of exhausting yourself trying to correct every misunderstanding that you didn't even fully understand, yet you did something that felt natural to you, but completely disrupted their expectations. You stayed grounded. You stayed still. You stayed focused on your own growth. And that stillness, chosen one, was not weakness. It was not avoidance. It was not a lack of awareness. It was a form of strength that operates on a level most people do not understand, because in a world where reaction is often mistaken for power, restraint becomes something that is easily underestimated. And that is exactly what happened here, because they had studied you based on a version of yourself that they believed would eventually break under pressure. They assumed that if enough confusion was created, if enough tension was introduced, if enough subtle resistance was placed in your path, you would respond in a way that would validate the narrative they had been building. They expected you to defend yourself aggressively, to react emotionally, to step out of alignment with who you are, just enough to give them the evidence they needed to reinforce their version of you. But instead, you remained centered. You remained consistent. You remained aligned with your values, even when the environment around you was not reflecting that same alignment back to you. And that is where everything began to shift in a way that they could not control. Because when someone is trying to manipulate perception, their strategy often relies on provoking a reaction that can be observed, interpreted, and then redistributed in a way that supports their narrative. But when that reaction never comes, when the person they are trying to influence refuses to step into that role, the entire structure they built begins to lose its foundation, because without new material to reinforce the distortion, the narrative starts to weaken over time. And that is the position you placed them in without even trying, simply by choosing to remain in your truth. And that choice, as simple as it may seem on the surface, is one of the most difficult things a person can do when faced with confusion. Because the natural instinct is to seek clarity, to ask questions, to defend your position, to try to correct what feels wrong, and yet something within you recognized that engaging at that level would not bring the resolution you were looking for. It would only pull you deeper into a dynamic that was not built on truth to begin with. And so you stepped back, not in a way that disconnected you from yourself, but in a way that protected your energy, your focus, your sense of direction. And in doing so, you created a space where your growth could continue without being constantly disrupted by external noise. And that is where your silence began to transform into something far more powerful than words. Because silence, when it is rooted in clarity, is not empty, it is not passive, it is filled with intention. It is filled with awareness. It is filled with a level of control that does not need to be announced to be effective. And that kind of silence cannot be easily interpreted by those who rely on reaction to understand people, because it does not give them the cues they are used to analyzing. It does not provide the emotional signals they expect to see. It does not fit into the patterns they have already studied. And that unpredictability is what creates discomfort on their side, because now they are no longer observing someone who can be easily mapped out. They are observing someone who has become internally anchored, someone who is no longer moving based on external pressure, someone who is no longer reacting in ways that can be anticipated or used against them. And that shift is what begins to reverse the dynamic. Because while they were once in a position of quiet control, using information to shape perception, they now find themselves in a position of uncertainty, trying to understand a version of you that no longer aligns with the data they collected, and that uncertainty is not something they can easily resolve because it is not coming from a lack of information. It is coming from a fundamental change in who you are, and that kind of change cannot be studied in the same way, it cannot be predicted in the same way, it cannot be controlled in the same way. And that is where your power becomes undeniable, not because you are trying to prove anything, not because you are trying to assert dominance over anyone, but because you are operating from a place that is no longer influenced by the same factors that once made you accessible to their strategy. And as this realization begins to take hold, you start to see your silence differently. You start to understand that it was never a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. A strength that allowed you to maintain your integrity in an environment that was not aligned with your truth. A strength that allowed you to continue growing, even when the feedback you were receiving did not fully reflect your reality. And that kind of strength is what creates lasting impact, because it is not dependent on external validation. It is not shaped by temporary perceptions. It is rooted in something deeper, something more stable, something that cannot be easily shaken by the opinions or actions of others. And that stability is what begins to shift how others perceive you over time. Because while narratives can influence perception, in the short term, consistency reveals truth in the long term. And as people continue to observe you, not through the lens that was once introduced to them, but through their own direct experience, they begin to notice the gaps, the inconsistencies, the places where the narrative does not align with what they are actually seeing. And that realization does not always happen all at once. It happens gradually in moments, in interactions, in small observations that begin to add up over time. And as those moments accumulate, the narrative that was once accepted without question starts to lose its credibility, not because you forced it to change, but because your reality made it impossible to sustain. And that is the power of remaining aligned with who you are, because it creates a level of consistency that cannot be easily dismissed, a level of presence that cannot be easily redefined. And as that presence becomes more visible, the space you occupy begins to change, not because you demanded it, but because the truth of who you are that begins to speak for itself in ways that no distortion can fully silence. And that is where the deeper shift takes place, not just in how others see you, but in how you see yourself, because once you recognize that your silence was not a limitation, but a form of power, you stop questioning it. You stop doubting it. You stop feeling the need to fill it with explanations or defenses. And instead, you begin to trust it. You begin to use it intentionally. You begin to understand that not every situation requires a response. Not every misunderstanding requires correction. Not every perception requires your energy. And that understanding is what allows you to move forward with a level of freedom that was not available to you before, because you are no longer tied to the need to control how others see you. You are focused on maintaining alignment with who you are. And that alignment is what creates the kind of presence that cannot be easily shaken, cannot be easily manipulated, and cannot be easily misunderstood. For long, because over time, truth has a way of revealing itself. And when it does not need to be defended. It simply needs to be seen. And that is exactly what is beginning to happen now, as the foundation you have built through your consistency, your resilience, your quiet strength begins to rise above the noise that once surrounded you, creating a clarity that was always there, but is only now becoming visible to those who are ready to see it. And as that quiet strength within you continued to solidify as your presence became more grounded, more consistent, more aligned with a truth that no longer depended on external validation, something else began to unfold in the background. Something that at first was almost invisible, almost imperceptible. Yet it carried the weight of inevitability, because while you were no longer feeding into the tension, no longer reacting in ways that could be used to reinforce a false narrative, the structure they had built around you was beginning to experience something it was never designed to withstand. And that was time, because time, chosen one, is the one force that exposes everything that is not built on truth, and what they had constructed required constant maintenance, constant alignment, constant reinforcement to keep it intact. And the moment that maintenance started to weaken even slightly, the cracks began to form, not in a dramatic or explosive way, but in subtle inconsistencies, small misalignments that started to raise questions in the minds of those who had once accepted the narrative without hesitation. Because when something is real, it holds together under pressure. It remains consistent across different contexts. It does not require constant explanation to make sense. But when something is constructed, when it is pieced together from fragments that do not fully align, it begins to show strain over time. And that strain is what people start to notice, even if they cannot immediately articulate it. They begin to feel that something is off, that the version of you they were given does not fully match the version of you they are experiencing directly. And that gap between perception and reality is where everything begins to shift, because once that gap becomes noticeable, it cannot be ignored indefinitely. It starts to grow. It starts to demand attention. It starts to create a kind of quiet tension in the minds of those who are observing it. And that tension leads to questions not always spoken out loud, but present. Nonetheless, questions about consistency, about credibility, about alignment. And those questions are what begin to destabilize the narrative that was once held so firmly, because a narrative that relies on control cannot survive in an environment where independent observation begins to take place. And that is exactly what your consistency created. It created an opportunity for others to see you for themselves without relying solely on what they had been told. And that direct experience is what begins to override the influence of secondhand perception. Because when people encounter you repeatedly in different situations, and the version of you they see does not match the version they were given, they are forced to reconcile that difference. They are forced to question which one is accurate. And that process does not happen all at once. It happens gradually in moments, in interactions, in small realizations that accumulate over time. And as those realizations build, the narrative that once seemed stable begins to lose its foundation. Not because you actively dismantled it, but because it could not withstand the weight of reality. And that is where the breakdown truly begins, because the people who once carried that narrative, who once repeated it, who once believed it without question, now find themselves in a position where they have to reassess what they accepted. And that reassessment creates a shift in how they engage with you, how they respond to you, how they interpret your presence. And while this shift may not be immediately visible, while it may not come with a clear acknowledgement or apology, it is happening nonetheless beneath the surface in the quiet recalibration of perception that takes place when truth begins to emerge. And at the same time, those who were responsible for shaping that narrative are experiencing a different kind of shift, one that is rooted in uncertainty. Because the control they once felt is no longer as stable as it was, the confidence they once had in their ability to influence perception is now being challenged by the inconsistencies that are becoming harder to ignore. And that uncertainty creates pressure, because maintaining a narrative that is beginning to unravel requires more effort, more coordination, more reinforcement than it did before. And that increased effort is not always sustainable, especially when the foundation itself is no longer secure. And this is where the dynamic begins to reverse in a way that is both subtle and powerful, because while they were once operating from a position of quiet control, using information to shape how others saw you, They are now operating from a position of quiet instability, trying to maintain something that is no longer holding together as easily as it once did, and that shift does not always manifest in obvious ways. It can show up as hesitation, as inconsistency, as a lack of alignment in how they present the narrative. And those inconsistencies are what others begin to pick up on, even if they do not immediately understand the full picture. They can sense that something is not as solid as it once appeared, and that sensing is what leads to further questioning, further observation, further evaluation. And as that process continues, the influence of the narrative continues to weaken, not because it was directly challenged, but because it could not sustain itself in the presence of truth. And this is the part that many people overlook because they expect resolution to come through confrontation, through exposure, through some kind of direct action that forces everything into the open. But in your case, chosen one, the resolution is coming through consistency, through the quiet, steady presence of who you are, through the simple act of continuing to show up in alignment with your truth. And that kind of resolution is far more powerful because it does not rely on external validation. It does not depend on others acknowledging what happened. It is rooted in a reality that becomes undeniable over time. And as that reality becomes more visible, the need for explanation begins to fade, because the contrast between what was said and what is seen becomes clear enough to speak for itself, and that clarity is what allows you to move forward without carrying the weight of what was once placed on you, because you are no longer operating within the confines of a narrative that was built without your consent. You are operating within the truth of who you are. And that truth is what continues to reveal itself in every space you enter, in every interaction you have, in every moment, where your presence reflects a consistency that cannot be easily dismissed or redefined. And as this process continues, you begin to see that what once felt like a disadvantage, what once felt like a period of confusion and misalignment, was actually creating the conditions for something much greater, because it allowed the false to reveal its own instability. It allowed the constructed to show its own cracks. It allowed the truth to rise without being forced. And that is the kind of shift that does not just resolve a situation, it transforms it. It redefines it. It places you in a position where you are no longer reacting to what was done. You are moving forward from a place of clarity, of understanding, of strength that has been tested and proven over time. And that is where your power becomes fully realized, not in a moment of confrontation, but in the quiet certainty that what is real does not need to be defended endlessly. It only needs to be lived consistently. And as you continue to live in that consistency, the breakdown of what was built against you becomes not just possible, but inevitable, because anything that is not aligned with truth cannot hold its shape indefinitely. And now, as you stand in this new awareness, you are no longer looking at the situation as something that happened to you. You are seeing it as something that revealed itself through you. Something that showed you the difference between perception and reality, between control and alignment, between what is constructed and what is real. And that understanding is what allows you to step into the next phase of your journey with a level of confidence that is not based on external approval, but on the clarity of knowing exactly who you are and how you move within the world, regardless of what was once said or believed about you. And as that entire structure continues to lose its grip, as the noise fades and the distortions weaken under the weight of your consistency, what remains is something they were never prepared to face, because you are no longer the version of yourself they once studied in silence. You are no longer the person they thought they had figured out. And that transformation is not loud. It is not forced. It is not something you had to announce. It is something that happened through endurance, through alignment, through a quiet evolution that took place while everything around you was trying to redefine you. And now that evolution has reached a point where it cannot be ignored, because your presence carries a different kind of energy, one that is no longer searching, no longer questioning, no longer adjusting itself to fit into spaces that were never aligned to begin with. And that is what unsettles them, chosen one, because what they once observed no longer exists in the same form. The patterns they memorized no longer apply, the reactions they predicted no longer happen, and the access they thought they had to understanding you is no longer available. And that loss of access is what creates the fear, not because you have become something aggressive or confrontational, but because you have become something self-contained, something internally stable, something that does not rely on external validation to maintain its shape. And that kind of presence cannot be easily influenced, cannot be easily redirected, cannot be easily broken down into something that fits a convenient narrative. And this is where the dynamic fully reverses, because the same silence they once used to study you has now become the space where their uncertainty grows. The same distance they once created to observe you has now become the distance that separates them from understanding you. And the same control they once believed they had has now dissolved into a realization that they are no longer operating from a position of influence, but from a position of reaction, trying to make sense of something that no longer fits within the framework they built. And that shift is not something you had to force. It is something that emerged naturally as a result of who you chose to become. Because while they were focused on analyzing you, you were focused on evolving. While they were focused on controlling perception, you were focused on strengthening your reality. And that difference in focus is what determines everything. Because perception can only go so far before it is confronted by reality. And when that confrontation happens, it is not the louder voice that wins, it is the more consistent truth, and that is exactly what you represent now. A truth that has been lived, tested, refined, and proven over time. And that truth does not need to be defended in every conversation. It does not need to be explained in every room. It carries itself in the way you move, in the way you respond, in the way you remain grounded, regardless of what is happening around you. And that is what creates the kind of presence that shifts environments without effort, because people can feel it. Even if they cannot immediately articulate it, they can sense the difference between what was said and what is real. They can see the alignment between your words and your actions. They can recognize the consistency that was always there but is now impossible to overlook. And as that recognition spreads quietly but steadily, the fear on the other side becomes more evident. Not always in obvious ways, but in subtle shifts, in hesitation, in the absence of the confidence that once defined their approach, because they are now faced with something they cannot easily manipulate, something they cannot easily predict, something they cannot easily contain, and that is what you have become. Not by accident, not by chance, but through a process that required you to stay aligned when it would have been easier to react, to stay grounded, when it would have been easier to question yourself, to stay consistent, when it would have been easier to adjust to the pressure around you. And that process has brought you to a place where you are no longer defined by what others thought they understood about you. You are defined by what has been revealed through your actions, through your presence, through your ability to remain true to yourself regardless of the circumstances. And that is where your true power lies, not in proving anything to anyone, not in correcting every misunderstanding, but in embodying a level of clarity that speaks for itself, a clarity that cannot be easily distorted, a clarity that becomes more visible with time. And as you continue to move forward from this place, you begin to realize that their fear is not something you need to respond to. It is simply a reflection of the gap between what they thought you were and what you have become, And that gap is something they cannot close because it is rooted in your growth, your awareness, your alignment. And those are things that cannot be undone, cannot be reversed, cannot be taken away. And that is why this moment matters, because it marks the point where you fully step into that understanding, where you stop looking back at what was said and start moving forward with a clarity that is no longer influenced by it, where you stop questioning the shifts you experienced and start recognizing them as confirmation of your evolution, and where you begin to see that everything you went through was not just something to endure. It was something that shaped you into someone who can no longer be easily studied, easily defined, or easily controlled. And that chosen one is what changes everything from here on out. And as everything settles into place, as the noise that once surrounded your name begins to dissolve, and the truth of who you are stands clearer than ever before, you begin to understand something that changes the way you see your entire journey. Because this was never just about what they did, it was about what you became in the process. It was about the way you held your ground when things didn't make sense, the way you stayed aligned when it would have been easier to react, the way you continued to grow even when the environment around you tried to define you in ways that were never accurate. And that realization shifts everything. Because now you are no longer looking at your past as a series of confusing moments. You are seeing it as a process of refinement, a process that revealed your strength, your awareness, your ability to remain grounded in your truth, regardless of what was happening around you. And that is what makes this moment so powerful, chosen one, because you are no longer searching for answers. You are standing in them. You are no longer questioning your path, you are recognizing it. And that recognition is what allows you to move forward without hesitation, without the weight of what was once placed on you, without the need to prove anything to anyone who chose to misunderstand you, because your life is no longer being shaped by what was said in rooms you were not in. It is being shaped by the clarity you carry into every room you choose to enter. And that clarity is not something that can be taken from you. It is something that has been built, tested, and strengthened over time. And as you continue to walk in that understanding, everything begins to align in ways that no one could have predicted, not even those who once studied you in silence, because they were never studying your future. They were studying a version of you that no longer exists. And now you are moving beyond that version, beyond those limitations, beyond those perceptions, into a space where your presence speaks louder than any narrative ever could. And if this message found you at the right time, if it confirmed something you've been feeling but couldn't fully explain, then don't let this moment pass without acknowledging it. Take a second right now to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and comment. I've evolved below because this is not the end of your story. This is the beginning of a new chapter where you are no longer being observed in silence. You are being recognized in truth, and that recognition is only going to grow from here.